Hi again, recording in progress. Welcome to panel 6A, Faith, Gender, and Identity. We'll be running for about 2 hours, and we have 5 speakers joining us today. So we have a lot of really interesting papers to get through. Hopefully we'll have enough time to take some questions at the end as well. So I feel like it's going to be a really great panel. I do want to 2 things before we start. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and in the interests of time, just so we can have a discussion afterwards, I would ask you to stick to the time limit. I really don't want to obviously interrupt you and say that your time is up. So if you could stick to 15 minutes, that would be great. The other thing is that I think that was the only thing. It was the time limit that we need to keep track of. We'll have a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand at the end, or you can put the questions in the chat and I'll be happy to read them out. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to begin Faith, Gender, and Identity. And our first speaker is Zorah Batul, and she is a PhD candidate at Jamia Millia Islamia. She has recently submitted her PhD thesis titled Religion, Public Sphere, and Political Mobilization, a case of mosques and shrines in Kashmir Valley, 1980 to the present. At the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, her main research interests are religion, gender and spatial politics, lived religion and post-colonial studies, public sphere in non-Western societies, political mobilization and conflict, with a focus on Islam and South Asia, in particular Kashmir. Her research and writings have appeared in Economic and Political Weekly, South Asian Review, Contemporary South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, LSE Engenderings, The Wire, The Telegraph, Greater Kashmir, and other local and national newspapers. And our final speaker has also joined us on that note. So we're all set to go. And Zorah will be talking to us about women negotiating public sphere in conflict-ridden Kashmir, a case of sacred sites. So whenever you're ready, Zorah, please feel free to begin. You can share your screen if you want.
So I'll start my presentation without any delay. First of all, I'm really thankful to Tasavvur and the team for giving me this opportunity to share my work. I'm very delighted to be here, and thanks everyone for joining in today. So the title of my presentation is Women Negotiating Public Sphere in Conflict-Ridden Kashmir, a Case of Sacred Sites. This presentation is part of my ongoing research on gender, religion, and spatial politics in South Asia, particularly Kashmir. I'll begin with a brief background of why I chose to work on sacred sites, especially shrine in this case. So the ongoing insurgency and intensive militarization in Kashmir has obstructed substantial women participation in the public sphere. Among the immediate consequences of over-securitization is the constraint, self-imposed or otherwise, on women's mobility in the public spaces. The conflict and its related uncertainties have also resulted in excessive control of women and their bodies. In most public places, especially during the late hours, one barely sees an unaccompanied woman. Fear of sexual harassment and conservative norms of society have reduced women's equal access and control over public spaces. So within that scenario, sacred spaces, whether it's mosques or shrines, fulfill a fundamental lacuna of spatial availability in the everyday disrupted existence of Kashmiri women by facilitating them to transcend beyond their domestic religion to a public religion in the public sphere. Therefore, I take the case study of shrines to elucidate how conflict, religion, and gender mutually shape and impact the other. One of the prominent concerns of my research is to highlight the nature of social arrangement and interactions possible in religious spaces. And in doing so, my research reflects on gender and identity issues in a public sphere dominated by an assertive religion and a continuous ongoing political movement. So I'll begin my presentation today by very briefly outlining the issues of identity and agency in Kashmir, wherein I argue that the identity of a Kashmiri women is much more complicated than men versus women or liberal versus conservative binaries. Then moving towards the multifaceted role of sacred spaces and its interaction with conflict. Subsequently, coming to the main concern of my presentation, that is the intersection of gender and spatial politics in Shrine within the context of conflict. Here I argue that Shrine can proliferate women's access to public places while maintaining the prevailing gender norms or patterns. So women's status and role in religion have been the focus of considerable scholarly research and debate, as religion has proven a favorable framework to interrogate, develop, and redefine gender theories of agency. Nonetheless, relatively, I believe that very few scholars working on Kashmir have explored, the interaction or intersection of political mobilization, especially activism, religious nationalism, gender politics, and the underlying structural limitations, especially at shrines or other sacred spaces. This oversight is actually surprising, since Shrine provides an important venue for reproducing and contesting various gendered aspects of social lives in Kashmir Valley. The space Shrine produced, especially in Kashmir, has different layers of politics, including gender, conflict, religion. So I'll come back to this issue in the succeeding section. However, before entering into the debate of Shrine visiting as a spatial practice, a very brief discussion on agency and women participation in public sphere, I believe, is important to comprehend the complexity of gender politics in conflict lucidly. So as far as the issue of gender and agency in contentious politics is concerned, it gets convoluted if one considers the suppression and subordination of Kashmiri men's sexuality, often violently, which is not unknown in Kashmir. The politics of masculinity is not simply between men or women, but it intersects with other factors to produce injustice. The way gender politics plays out in Kashmir, as I said, is far more complicated than liberal versus conservative binary. Here, the identity of women intersects with other factors such as post-colonial, third world, religion, and especially conflict. From my research in Kashmir, I have found out that conflict largely determines the discourse of gender politics in Kashmir Valley, and the reason behind it probably is the conflicts, related unanticipated tribulations that has affected women as equally as men, if not more. Consequently, one see women more often on streets for conflict-related, political issues than for purely gender issues, if there is something like that, unlike, in other conventional societies without conflict. The lack of substantial collaboration on gender-related issues also reflect the complex relationship between the movement of, ongoing political movement in Kashmir and women's demand for equal rights. Now, coming to the role of shrine and mysticism in Kashmir Valley. In Kashmir, every village has a shrine where rishis and peets took their abode and practiced meditation. The appeal of mysticism and its inclusive ethos have played many crucial role in Kashmir. However, the focus has largely been on their, role in facilitating Kashmir's transition to Islam during the medieval period. To begin with, one of the potential of Sufi shrines in conflict lies in its healing power, as often it is the only space that offers sanctuary for people dealing with the precariousness of life in conflict. While describing shrine visiting experience, most women often use the expression sukoon, that is peace, or boj halka hona, that is unburdening. Likewise, shrine played a vital role in the battle for local leadership and autonomy from the Dogra rule during the 1930s. Even if we see in contemporary times, shrine provides a very important venue where from people mobilize for, mobilize or, take part in protest for non-religious purposes. The space shrine create is also crucial in terms of women's participation in the public sphere. In Kashmir, we see that except for local area mosques, most of the major mosques and shrines, allow women to pray, and women often visit these places, including the main Jamia Masjid, Dastagir Sahab, Hazrat Bal, among others. In fact, one noticed more women in shrine than in mosque. Indeed, many people think of shrine as a feminine arena due to the higher involvement of women. So coming to the core of my research concern, that is gender and spatial politics in shrine, many political theorists have argued that our consciousness and experience of space are gendered. The spatial settings profoundly impacts a woman's notion of herself and her location in society. Men and women perceive, utilize space differently, as Michelle Rosaldo, an anthropologist, puts it. Women's position is lowest in society with highly segregated private and public sphere. So in Kashmir, even though women are significant to the whole shrine ecosystem, they are also the primary participant in shrine's ritual, while at the same time contributing financially for the maintenance of the shrine and the income of the priest. They are not fully involved in the administration. There are many shrines in Kashmir with internal spatial protocols where access to the tomb is restricted. At most shrines, women are forbidden near the tomb, and sometimes even in the central premises. To give a concise overview of gender dynamics at places of worship, I visited a few shrines and mosques in Kashmir. However, today I'll just discuss Hazrat Bal and Dastagir Sahab because of time constraint. Broadly, in both the shrines, men control both the spatial setting and administrative arrangements. Hazrat Bal Shrine, situated on the bank of Dal Lake, has great social and symbolic value for the women of Kashmir. The shrine is also the repository of Prophet Muhammad's beard hair, also known as Mu'e Muqaddas. Akin to other shrines, it also has a separate section for men and women. However, since there is no tomb in this shrine, I suppose the aim of separate spaces is to create private area for women to pray rather than inhabiting women from the most sacred center. Hazrat Bal also, when compared to other shrines in Kashmir, is politically more active. Protest often breaks out after Ijtima, that is Islamic congregation, or after Eid prayers or Friday prayers within Hazrat Bal and also in its vicinities. Although these protests mostly occurs in the male section, but occasionally women also participate in them. Besides, after prayer, during prayer, during namaz, prayer is also performed for the martyrs of the Kashmir's movement. Another well-regarded shrine, which I'm going to discuss today, is Dastagir Sahab. Both women and men here can, sit in the central premises. Women are even allowed near the tomb, except during the prayer time, when only men are allowed to offer namaz in the central premises. At that time, women has to wait outside or in a different, section. However, at Dastagir Sahab, the people I interviewed, mostly men, were largely skeptical about women's participation in shrine rituals. Some, believe that women should be forbidden near the tomb or even in the shrines, since unlike men, they are not obliged to visit mosques or shrines to offer their prayers. Upon asking a women supplicant if women should refrain from visiting shrine, to my surprise, she stated, and I quote, the translation is mine, "It is preferred that women praise at home. I come here for tasalli," which is satisfaction or also comfort in this context. So very interestingly, the contradiction in her actions and beliefs make one contemplate how convoluted actual life and its decisions are from the logic of, scholastic microsome. During the period of my fieldwork, I also asked the reason behind women's limited spatial, accessibility and administrative involvement in the shrine. And the only explanation people, both men and women, could give was because of being a woman. I asked again, is it because women menstruate? Some answered they do not know the definite logic, while others argued that it's just to create a private area for women to pray. So as far as Kashmiri, local Rishi culture is concerned, so Rishis were the indigenous mystics of Kashmir. Women were not discriminated against. Rishis, in fact, believed that women are equally capable of, becoming mystics. And there are several examples of women aesthetics, and saints from Kashmir, such as Bihad Bibi and Dehad Bibi. They were the disciple of Nund Rishi, who is, also considered as one of the founders of Rishi orders in Kashmir and respected by both the Muslims and the Hindus of the valley. So Bihad Bibi and Dehad Bibi are believed to be present at a meeting that took place between Nund Rishi and Mir Sayyid Muhammad Hamdani, another very prominent Sufi from Central Asia. The presence of these two female mystics in such an important meeting seemingly validates that they were regarded very highly by the rishis. In fact, according to local belief, Nund Rishi's first teacher is said to have been Laldet, also known as Lala Arifa or Laleshwari, a woman who is looked upon with great respect by Kashmiri, both Hindus and Muslims. These rishis and Sufis had individualistic relation with God, which was more spiritual and wide-ranging than confined to a single way. So therefore, these conservative, societal norms often raise the recurring question as to why women would agree to be part of a system that reinforces their subservient status. Are these women misled by a false consciousness, or are they passive victim of a system that undermines their interest? So I've taken the help of Judith Butler. I would not say to answer, but to understand the issue. Judith Butler, a philosopher and gender theorist, provide a very comprehensive insight into the complicated nature of women agency. Butler argues that individual aspirations and identities are determined by socio-cultural context, and calling the entire frame into question is perhaps to subject one's very existence to uncertainty. However, she also adds that even though social norms construct our being, they do not define them once and for all. Hence, human agency is possible within these power structure, but might not be as always as external opposition to them. For instance, Islamic feminist challenge to the patriarchal image of God within the Islamic traditions. Interestingly, the participation of women in religion also demonstrate how women resist oppressive institutions and practice without completely discarding the system which constitutes their reality. Now, I'll very briefly summarize the main highlights of my presentation today. So number one, that the ongoing conflict creates conditions within which women issues are rendered unimportant. Therefore, I stress the urgency of incorporating everyday politics of gender oppression in a more nuanced analysis to see tangible result in future and immediate goals. Notably, feminists from Kashmir needs to question the spatial structure of power robustly without falling into the analytical trap of instrumentalizing women's suffering to portray patriarchy as exclusively Muslim or Kashmiri problem. Besides, I also attempted to demonstrate that Shrine offers both social as well as political space. They are also instrumental in creating political awareness about the Kashmir's political crisis or movement. At Shrine, both men and women listen to the khutbahs, that is sermons, which is very much politically charged. And occasionally when there is protest, women also participate. Hence, shrines also act as a space for collective action, even though the control remains with the men who act as the guardian, as well as, who maintains the shrine. Women negotiate sacred spaces to produce a socially engaged religion. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I am within time. Trying to
No, that was perfect. Thank you. You were well within time, and I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't have stopped you if you went over this really, really interesting paper. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I mean, I love that this panel has, we're engaging with this idea of shrines and sacred sites in many different ways, but I love how, we have this understanding of the importance of shrines and sacred sites. And I love that you were able to put it in a Kashmiri context for us, which is always really, really interesting. So thank you so much for that. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Saira Mahmoud, who is an MPhil scholar at the University of Karachi. She is an MPhil scholar at the Department of English and the University of Karachi. Sorry, her research interests include religion and fiction, feminisms in South Asian, and the representation of Muslims on page and screen. And today she will be talking to us about, this sounds so interesting, writing Orthodox women, religion as a blind spot in Pakistani fiction. Thank you so much for joining us, Saira. Please go ahead whenever you're ready. If you want me to share your screen, I can do that for you. If you want to do it, you're more than welcome to, because I have your presentation. I think.
Let me just try. I think I'm good with sharing the presentation.
If you can do it, go. Fine.
Can you see it? Is it up there?
Yeah, it's there. Perfect.
Right. So hi everyone. I'd like like to start off by saying how excited I am to be here today. This has been such a wonderful symposium so far, and the organizers deserve all the credit in bringing together such a diverse range of voices. Zora's presentation was so interesting, especially the part that where she talked about Judith Butler and conceptions of agency overlap with my own presentation, in which I talk about Saira Mahmoud's conceptions of agency and faith. All right, so my own research that I'll be presenting today is very much what you would call an idea under construction. It came about actually in response to some of the thought-provoking topics that were listed in the Tasavvur call for paper. So it isn't something that I had been working on for a long time. It isn't a paper yet. And while I was putting together what I'm presenting today, I noticed the depth of research still left to do on this particular topic. But it is sometimes like that. You start off and then you see how much there is. So I welcome very much any comments or thoughts. As I've said, the research is a bit scattered, so I'll go a bit long on the introduction and pull all these ideas together, and then we can sort of move on swiftly from there. So basically, the presentation will focus on how Pakistani English language fiction, which I'll be calling Anglophone fiction throughout, marginalizes the experiences of Orthodox, or what you might call religiously practicing or devout Muslims, in particular Muslim women. And it does this by offering very impoverished looks, a very impoverished or truncated look at their lives, feelings, desires, and motivations. And I believe that Pakistani Anglophone authors sometimes find themselves ill-equipped to equipped with a worldview that is in itself ill-equipped to make sense of Orthodox life forms. And it only conceives of Orthodox life forms through the lens of an ossified and domineering religiosity. So this secular liberal lens through which they examine Orthodox Muslim women renders itself to looking at them as passive or helpless victims, or else women who are sort of part of a backwards tradition who might not have voice or agency. The thesis of the work then follows from this, and I talk about the ways in which I find that these women and their voices are marginalized. So the thesis reads, Pakistani Anglophone fiction, particularly that which follows in the immediate wake of 9/11, largely denies agential status to Orthodox Muslims, particularly women, by A, marginalizing the voices and experiences of these women, and B, defining agency as only the resistance to or subversion of norms, as opposed to the moral autonomy of the subject. This representation of Orthodox women plays into dominant good Muslim, bad Muslim tropes, and reinforces a worldview that sees religion in the public sphere as suspicious and dangerous, while preferring a mode of religious observance that is more spiritual and delinks devotional feelings from ritualistic norms. Before we talk about the particularized examples from which the two novels under discussion that lend themselves to these ideas and how and why they do so, it's important to talk about what I mean when I say orthodox. So the word orthodox derives from a Greek root, which means correct opinion. And in its most theological conceptualization, this refers to church-approved, acceptable doctrinal opinions that stand in contrast to heretical doctrines. But this isn't what I'm getting at when I use the word orthodox. I use it in its more generalized sense, whereas a person may be orthodox, which would mean that they conform to the generally accepted beliefs of a particular faith system, in this case, Islam. You'll see that I have this definition and this point up at number 2 over here. But even before that, I wanted orthodox to encapsulate a sense of devotional feeling, a person who really believes in and whose actions conform to a faith tradition, in this case, Islam. So you have interested in cultivating a pious self. And then these people or Orthodox Muslims might have ways of presenting to the world that signal them out as distinctively Muslims. For example, I'm thinking of men with beards and prayer caps, or women in hijab and niqab. And these willingly chosen markers would then signal them out. So the two books under discussion are Kamila Shamsi's Broken Verses and Uzma Samsan's Geometry of God. both published in the same decade as 9/11, and both dealing with, interestingly, Ziaul Haq's Islamist regime in Pakistan. Broken Verses is set primarily in the 1990s, where our 31-year-old protagonist, Asmani Inqilab, searches of answers for what happened to her fiery feminist activist mother and her mother's lover, simply called the poet, both of whom pushed back against Islamization of Pakistan nearly 15 years before the novel is set. This novel oscillates fluidly between the past, a dark and haunting regime of terror and suffocation, and the present, a society ruptured by religious fervor and ideological conflict. Geometry of God is mostly set during the Zia years and follows two granddaughters, Amal and Mehwish, of a paleontologist, Tasavvur, whose archaeological findings are proof of Darwinian evolution, and thus he is targeted by the party of creation, the Jamaat-e-Pedaish, who wish to enforce stringent codes of Islamic morality and regulate thought and science to fit within their narrow readings of religious scripture. The novel also features a prominent narrator in Numan, the son of a leading member of the party of creation, who is increasingly disillusioned by his job of writing treatises that twist religion and history and science to guarantee that these thoughts and ideas toe the party line. Both of these novels also trace the role of the United States and the Pakistani military in creating the conditions ripe for the ferment of Islamic fundamentalism, the so-called Mullah military alliance. So these novels feature female characters prominently. Broken Verses has a female narrator throughout. Geometry of God allows Amal and Mehwish to narrate most of the book. These prominent female characters are either self-avowedly secular, as is the case with Samina Akram, the feminist activist, and Asmani's mother and Asmani herself, or these female characters are apathetic to religion, as is the case with Amal, who drinks, parties, and in general does not seem to think about religion except as an imposition on her life and her grandfather's research. Or these female characters are shown to possess a transcendental form of spirituality that bypasses the need for ritualistic worship or conformity to doctrine, such as the case with the blind Mehwish, who seems to draw and talk to a divine figure named Clog, a misreading of the word God. Outside of these central characters, we have plenty of other women in the scene, such as Asmani's sister, stepmother, and an old actress friend of her mom's in Broken Verses, and Amal's friend in Geometry of God. These characters are not orthodox. Where orthodox female characters do appear, they are either shown to be hypocrites with little textual knowledge of the Islam they choose to preach, disguising their bigotry under a false guise of piety, or they are revealed to be helpless and brainwashed followers of a patriarchal tradition, too unassuming and too submissive to critique the dominant patriarchal ideologies that govern their lives. So let's look at a few examples. In Broken Verses, you don't really get many orthodox or even outwardly religiously conformist women that get a chance to speak or make their case. But I did find one interesting instance of a neighbor of Asmani's who would police and enforce religious behavior around. The novel mentions her thus: Ramzan was a month when the holier than thous were in their element. We used to have one of them as a neighbor, and every year she'd make a list of people who weren't fasting, and every day of the month before daybreak, she'd call someone on the list and recite Quranic verses down the phone, hoping to effect a change of heart. She made the mistake of calling the poet once, and when his limited knowledge of Arabic, he realized he was reading, at random, a verse about the inheritance laws. Being well aware of both the woman's identity and her family scandals, he responded by pointing out that under the God-ordained laws that she had just read out, she and her husband had cheated her sister-in-law out of her rightful share of family fortune. So here we have this woman who polices religious behavior. She is a cop. She's someone whose behavior is inappropriate, and it's actually the poet who calls her out and schools her on proper religiosity. And in Geometry of God, we have a prominent side character who we encounter as someone who is religious, presents as religious, is deeply interested in religion, and becomes somewhat of religious authority. So when Mehwish goes blind, Mehwish and Amal's mother, grieving mother, is visited by a distant relative called Apa Farzana. And Apa Farzana is forever policing the behavior of Mehwish and Amal. So here is a dialogue between her and Amma, Mehwish and Amal's mother, where she says her spine is created weak for receiving and bending. It is written, and we must teach your daughter. And Amma replies, it was always so. So this is, she's quoting a Quranic, her interpretation of a Quranic injunction showing that, women should be subservient to men. So her goal throughout the novel is just this background noise of patriarchal, religiously inspired advice. And Amma, once she becomes religious, is shown as this hapless sort of victim who falls victim to her and does not challenge these interpretations. I'd like to draw our attention here to the prominent role that Orthodox women have played throughout the Islamic revival in challenging patriarchal norms and tradition and subverting traditional gender. From Iran to Pakistan to Afghanistan, the return of more Islamic modes of sociability and conduct in many Muslim majority countries has been followed by Muslim women's reappropriation of sacred texts to argue for more equitable social reforms between men and women. Broken Verses does reference such a history, noting that Samina traveled to Egypt to work with Muslim feminists so she could, quote, discover the feminist traditions within Islam, which would allow her to battle the hardliners on their own turf. But, end quote, but such a practice subordinates Islam to the political purpose of liberatory feminism. There is little to no acknowledgement that either of these novels of Orthodox Muslim women challenging textual patriarchy, which in reality they have done so, out of a genuine belief that divinely ordained regulations and practices would not sideline Muslim women. Furthermore, as Saira Mahmoud has argued, the secular liberal worldview that locates subject's agency only in the transgression and subversion of norms fails to account for different life forms and ways of being, an honest assessment of which would force us to confront the possibility that moral agency may be found within subjects who conform to and uphold certain norms and rituals that do not draw from the ideals of individual freedom. The actions and bodily comportment of these subjects within these hierarchical structures is also reflective of a kind of agency. In effect, both these novels inadvertently draw on Mamdani's identified tropes of good Muslim, bad Muslim, wherein the good Muslim, secular feminist characters in this case, dismiss the bad Muslim, Orthodox, and/or conformist women as agents of the patriarchy on one hand, or childlike victims to be saved on the other. Consider Samina learning about Islamic feminism to battle Muslim hardliners, or the poet schooling the neighbor on her misuse of Quranic verses. Within these ways of seeing the world, religion's eruption into the public sphere is a cause of concern, and both novels show how a public Islam is the domain of normative mullah sensibilities used to subjugate women through theological formulations. In articulating these worries, the novels turn onto Islam a gaze of suspicion, showing us that it must be regulated or else would pose a massive damage to hard-won freedoms. The reasons for why this mode of representation of Orthodox Muslims, especially women, has dominated Pakistani fiction immediately after 9/11, and indeed still does, are multifaceted and various. Re-Orientalism, a term used by Lisa Law to describe the perpetuation of Orientalism by Orientals themselves, may come from the class position of the authors writing about Pakistan in English, a position which may cause them to share a worldview with colonizers. As Law has shown, South Asian diasporic or cosmopolitan authors are more likely to get publishing deals, and the metropolitan publishing industries with their localized centers in New York and London are likely to publish works that feed into Orientalist mythology, marginalizing writers that do not play off of tropes of the threat of Islamic fundamentalism or the subjugation of women, as Graham Huggan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has shown in Marketing the Margins. This does not, of course, mean that all authors who critique Islamic fundamentalism are guilty of playing to a gallery of publishers, but simply that this is how publishing bias ensures that similar sounding voices get elevated above other more diverse. There's also the modern turns towards spirituality devoid of ritualistic religion, the rise of spiritual but not religious, and how Islamic and Eastern religious traditions are now called upon to provide pacifist and often stripped down feel-good religious frameworks for Western consumption, as Sophia Rosarjana has shown in Buying Buddha, Selling Rumi, Orientalism, and the Mystical Marketplace. This sort of brings my presentation to an end. I hope I was within the time limit. But yeah, so basically the idea being that these are the reasons or the representation of Orthodox Muslim women as we found them.
Thank you so much for that, Saira. Some really, really incredible ideas. And funnily enough, one of the questions that I was thinking of asking you actually towards the end, you answered in your conclusion when you talked about, the position of the author and this idea of Anglophone fiction usually being published from bases in London and New York, and they're being written in English and they're being written for a very particular audience, both in Pakistan and worldwide. So you kind of see the depiction of Orthodox Muslim women is geared towards an audience, geared towards the audience that's going to consume that fiction, supposedly. So I mean, some really incredible ideas, and I'm really excited actually for the Q&A session and the feedback, and hopefully you made us all really happy when you said that you actually came up with this after you read our CFP. So hopefully we can give you some good feedback and comments, and you won't regret this, I promise. So thank you very, very much. So without further ado, I will stop gushing now. We'll move on to our next speaker. Let me just have a look. Yeah, our next speaker is Shahana Munazir. You're here. Yes, you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll do a quick intro. So Shahana joined UW-Madison for a PhD in cultural anthropology in the fall of 2019. Her current research examines the intersections of politics of care, religion, education, and capitalism in India. In particular, she is interested in exploring the ethical formulation of girls' gendered kinship relations, health, and care at home. Her research is being supported by the American Institute of Indian Studies, UW-Madison Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and the Department of Anthropology. She has a bachelor's degree in history from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and an MPhil in anthropology from the University of Oxford on the Indira Gandhi Oxford Graduate Scholarship at Somerville College. And she will today be talking to us about, let me read your new title, Temporalizing Care, Concerns of Destiny in the Lives of Gharelu Muslim Women in India. This is the new one, right?
Yeah,
amazing.
Thank you, Fatima.
Amazing.
Okay, I do have a screen to share, so I can go ahead and do that, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. You should be able to.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Give it a second. I think it's loading. No, it's blank right now.
Can you see now? No?
No, it's still blank. I mean, is it not just me? It is blank, right?
There's a black screen for me as
Okay,
well.
hold on. Let me try again.
No.
When you click on the share content button, make sure that you're sharing the window that has the PowerPoint. Like there will be.
Okay, okay. Is it there now? Because it
No,
shows
it's
on
still
mine.
blank.
Still a black screen, unfortunately.
If you have the screen share, you can do
Yeah,
that.
I'll just share it for you. Absolutely.
I'm so sorry about this.
No problem. This is why we have a tech person, and this is why we have presentations on hand. So don't worry about it. I will just, there we go. Can we all see that?
Yes.
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. So do I have control of the screen, or will you move forward to the next slide?
Just give me a shout. I'll change the slides for you.
Okay, cool. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tasavvur Collective, for this incredible symposium, which has been amazing so far. I think I've learned a lot, and it's simply amazing to sort of engage with so many Muslim women and otherwise who've sort of presented on various topics of interest. So as Fatima mentioned, I am sort of speaking about anthropological concepts of destiny, ethnographies of future making, Islamic womanhood, agency of Gharelu women who primarily stay at home and are involved in active caregiving within households. You can move to the next slide, Fatima. Yeah. Okay, in a lower middle class, and some of this comes from some from a field work in the past couple of years. The name has been obviously anonymized, and I'm still to undertake a lot of field work going forward. So this is a work in progress. In a lower middle class, impoverished Muslim neighborhood in Patna, which is in Bihar and northern part of India, Nadia, a 25-year-old pious Muslim woman, graduated from an Islamic school in 2016. With the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, Nadia dropped out of a local college in Patna. Pertinently, the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act in late 2019 and the pandemic, of course, has resulted in many schools and colleges remaining shut and forcing students to drop out and stay at home, indefinitely so. Nadia now stays at home teaching Quran and Hadith to young children in the neighborhood and looking after her parents and grandmother, doing most of the household chores. Can we move to the next slide, please? She hopes that caring for her parents will bring her blessings and divine rewards, which will shape her destiny, a quote-unquote takdir, or a good life. Many young Muslim women in Bihar, like Nadia, have dropped out of education after high school and have become caregivers at home, or quote-unquote gharelu. Gharelu is a term used by many women like herself to sort of call themselves as stay-at-home caregivers who are more family-oriented and career-oriented, financially independent women. Over the past few decades, anthropologists of time and temporality have evolved away from an overemphasis on the past. Rather, there is a growing interest in theorizing the future. Yet, there is an active disregard of how divine temporalities shape individuals present and future. So in this sort of paper on this conference, I examined the role of Islamic destiny in conditioning pious Muslim women's current role as caregivers at home and their hopes for a better future. Based on field notes in the last few years from a predominantly Muslim neighborhood in Patna, I moved beyond the usual stereotypes of empowerment and aspiration associated with quote-unquote modern or outgoing Muslim women and quote-unquote traditional for Gharelu women. I argue that stay-at-home Islamic women such as Nadia use the concept of destiny as a malleable concept in traversing the effects and aspirations such as love and resentment, connection and disconnection of everyday caregiving. In doing so, they shape the imaginations of a good life, not as a utopia, but as an activity with transformative potential that can bring new futures into being. Can we have the next slide? I bring temporality, relatedness, and care, concepts that are hardly addressed in the existing scholarship on Islamic womanhood in India. The predominant idea of a new age and modern Islamic womanhood is usually understood against the backdrop of India's liberalization policies in the 1990s and the process of globalization thereafter. Much of this scholarship is sort of based upon Arjun Appadurai's concept of the capacity to aspire and the future as a cultural fact, which theorize aspiration as an a priori ideal of empowerment. In this context of capitalistic modernity in contemporary India, being Gharelu, by virtue of staying at home as caregivers, is often associated with passivity or a lack of socio-political and financial aspiration. This typecasting of contemporary Islamic womanhood as modern reinforces Western neoliberal assumptions and stereotypes about Muslim lives, without taking into account some of the local idioms of time, ethics, and other analytical lenses that illuminate the everyday experiences of Muslim women in India. In what follows then, my study shows that being Gharelu is not just a practice, but it's also an attribute. It's an alluring habitus and an ongoing process of self-improvement aided by caregiving. Furthermore, it provides an opportunity for us to explore the relations and forms of existence in a decolonial framework that centers unique epistemologies, goals, and mandates at big communities in this context. Next slide, Fatima, please. Caught within the dominant ideological forces of modernity and globalization, anthropological scholarship on Muslim women has pushed temporal concerns related to destiny and Islamic notions of care and future-making to the margins. My aim is then to recenter these concerns, focusing on the construction of Islamic womanhood of vulnerable Muslim women in smaller cities in India through embodied practices of everyday care and women's belief in destiny that they use to find ways and motivations to transform their own future. Thus, I see anthropological ideas of time and care as interrelated rather than as separate areas of inquiry. In households in India that are attentive to Islamic ethos, Muslim women often embody the theological conception of Islamic destiny through practices of religiosity at home and through their learning in Islamic schools. Colloquially called takdir, the concept holds a wide-ranging meaning in different South Asian Muslim settings. It is often used as an explanation of something that has not gone the way one would have wished, or simply used as another epithet of futurity. But in other contexts, It also points to the malleability of the future to come, which actualizes time as social practice and illustrates how human agency is constructed through time, often through the invocation of the future into the present. Thus, far from being a meaningless verbal hyperbole of an irrevocable future, women in the present context invoke destiny to make sense of their emotions, roles, and obligations as caregivers in the present and rely on divine will to imagine their unseen life outcomes in the future. Next slide. In the absence of support from the state and society for socioeconomically vulnerable Muslim women, caregivers in impoverished neighborhoods, Taqdeer holds a special meaning. Many even frown upon the idea of old age homes to care for the elderly. In these households, ordinary caregiving has its own script, based on helping the elderly while also enhancing the caregiver's moral standing and building a better destiny. Thus, for women like Nadia, the idea of better futures, or Taqdeer, is strategically built over time by means of divine rewards, as well as blessings from the elderly through practices of care. These rewards are felt strongly by way of deepening intergenerational ties, hopes of financial security, and better marital prospects in the future. Despite the drudgery of mundane care work, and in contrast to what is usually theorized about Indian housewives, Nadia does not show boredom or passivity when she stays at home. Rather, she argues that her current role as a caregiver for her aging parents is part of an inscrutable divine plan, one that is greater than the human plan and that never excludes the possibility of change. In other words, Nadia's role as a full-time caregiver was influenced by her belief in the Islamic temporality of destiny, woven into the idea through the idea of quotidian care, and her indefatigable determination in the practice of future making. Thus, young women, Muslim women's domestic care work, otherwise dismissed as passive and lacking in modern aspirations, becomes a productive social tool to create their future. Working in different settings, anthropologists of care have offered ethnographic evidence to show how caregiving is not necessarily always driven by compassion. Amira Metovia's ethnography in Cairo, for example, offers an example of how bureaucratization drives Islamic ethics of care in Islamic charities. Similarly, in the context of Thailand, Felicity Orlino shows that care is a matter of practical work, bodily ritual, and karmic morality that decenters the sentimentalized and morally loaded aspects of care. Similarly, my work within Muslim households in India has also shown me that caregiving at home is not always driven by emotions, but is often considered a way of repaying parental debt. And young women in gendered households experience parental pressure to perform household duties. In such conditions, women like Nadia find localized religious expressions of destiny useful to undertake the simultaneously necessity and impossibility of caregiving. On one or two occasions, Nadia has expressed resentment about how most of her time is spent taking care of her grandmother's medications and doing household chores. During that moment of resentment, Nadia invokes fate or her taqdeer and how things will turn out for the better through the blessings of her grandmother. In Nadia's expressions of destiny, there's a subtle note about divine will, guiding her present responsibilities and how she will be rewarded in the future for her resilience. This obviously does not mean that all of Nadia's actions are guided through destiny, but it does mean that destiny involves intimate everyday actions. That also invites us to think about the future ethnographically as a means of understanding the present as opposed to the past. Next slide. Anthropology has long been preoccupied with the concept of time. However, for the most part of the 19th and early 20th century, the conception of time was actually anthropologists' preoccupation with time in non-Western societies that created a sense of the other and represented such societies as people without history. Temporality was often conceptualized as something inherent or a given part of indigenous culture. Anthropologists' conceptions of social time, linear or circular time, modern or pre-modern time, was a byproduct of this homogeneity. Not only did these early anthropological movements of functionalism and structuralism overlook time as a feature of theoretical model, but it also created an imagination of homogeneous groups that adhered to a particular, often limited understanding of time and its social practice. The temporal turn in the 1970s and the 80s has geared itself precisely to overcome this unilinear sighting of the past into the present, and to give urgency to understanding temporality as a social experience instead of a linear abstraction of the past. However, it continues to leave the inevitability of the future and the role of the divine in the hazy background for its ethnographic and theoretical discussions. Since the 2000s, there has been a surge of writing about the future in anthropology. Much of this scholarship gave us a sense of uncertainty and doubt, assessing capitalism's inequality while simultaneously representing a nostalgia for a failed modernity. It left us with feelings of an abstract foreboding future, or gave us hopes of an aspirational progressive future. The core of this modern social time is capitalism's time reckoning and its conflict with everyday life. In response to this abstract futurity of modern time, in the last decade, scholars theorizing about the future have done so in response to temporality as productive human agency. For example, exploring intermittent temporalities of the everyday, anthropologists have recognized that time is material and social, and how such waiting times, especially for the youth, for example, Greg Jeffrey's work in Time Pass, productively forceful towards the future, concurring with the theoretical arguments of people like scholars like Pierre Bourdieu, Nancy Munn, and others. Time that is incorporated in practice. The scholarship grounds a manifestation of time through the prism of youth. However, once again, there is a subtle citing of the past and the present, calling for reassessment of the universality of global conditions created by capitalism, rather than an assessment of how the future resides in or draws in the present. Furthermore, scholars continue to use the Western vocabulary and the European-derived temporal concepts that have often filtered through some of these ethnographies in ways that are then subtly distorting. Ultimately, it reinforces the fixedness of the socioeconomic and political positionalities of vulnerable populations within Western-derived models of progress and aspiration. Thus, I find that while there is a growing interest of futurism and the futuristic, especially in the realms of capitalistic modernity, such futuristic imaginations take us too far beyond the futuralism of the everyday, an individual agency in manipulating time. The idea of abstract temporalization understood through the lens of modernity has to be substantiated with the local religious idioms of temporality that then invite us to understand the future as a means to understand the present. The next slide. Recent ethnographic studies on destiny, for example, Laura Menin's work, provides an important addition to this concept of destiny as malleably fixed. In the context of a Moroccan field site, Alice Elliott has noted that beliefs of women in the irrevocable destiny goes alongside a striving to alter it. This concept of malleable fixity provides a productive starting point to explore divine agency and its impact on human actions. The last slide, please. Adding the dimension of care to the temporality of destiny shows that rather than being overwhelmed by the fatalistic doom and gloom of the everyday, the nitty-gritty of capitalism, Nalia and many others like her in Patna seem to actively and thoughtfully engage with it. Therefore, despite gender-based expectations and unequal responsibilities in households, everyday care by these Muslim women and their belief in destiny is not passive and it's not non-agential. Rather, the ubiquitous use of the religious vocabulary, in this case destiny, in the everyday illustrates how young women construct renewed meanings of caregiving and in the process make strategic use of faith connections and kinship bonds to achieve personal ends. Additionally, these innovative practices of generating better futures reveal the significance that women attach to the depths of future time and is a marker of how Muslim women of low-income households in India frame their personal desires and social worlds. It then prods us to shift anthropology's gaze from the past, building the present to examine how the future shapes present actions and situations. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Shahana. That was really, really interesting. I love, presentations that revolve around field work and archives and oral history. I think it's so interesting. And it's really timely as well, obviously, because as you said, you're talking about, you're talking about the pandemic, you're talking about the impact that it's had on these women. And some interesting parallels, I think, as well with Saira's paper, and we can talk a little bit more about, whether that's the depiction of Muslim women as gharelu, whether it's, the way that this, whether the way that Orthodox or more conservative Muslim women are treated in fiction in real life. So I think that, a really good way to link through the paper. So again, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Okay, I'll stop sharing now. Our next paper, where's my list? I'm sorry, there are so many papers around. This is not a very environmentally friendly conference at this point, I believe. Our next paper is by Deepanshu Sharma, who has recently completed his PhD thesis at History Department, Jamia Millia, Islamia, New Delhi. His research area focuses on Sufi literature of the 14th century. For the last 6 months, he has been working as assistant professor at lovely Professional University, Punjab. So thank you so much for joining us. The paper title is Situating the Woman in the Chishti Mystic Space, an analysis of, and I apologize in advance if I'm going to get this title horribly wrong, Fawadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis. Okay, I'll take it.
Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to read my paper. And let me reiterate my title. It's Situating the Women in the Chishti Mystic Space, an analysis of Fawadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis. So with the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, Sufism also consolidated into the major parts of Indian subcontinent. There were various Sufi orders during 13th, 14th centuries, that is Chishtis and Sohrawardi. Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti was the founder of Chishti Sufi order in India, and he was followed by a lineage of prominent Chishti Sufis, namely Sheikh Qutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, Sheikh Farid, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, and Sheikh Nasiruddin Chiragh Dili. The key characteristics of the Chishti Sufis was that they emphasized on humanistic aspect of Sufism. They were fond of sama, musical assemblies, and frequently organized that in their khanqahs. The Chishti Sufis also organized langar, free kitchens in their khanqah, where large amount of people used to come. They also played a significant role in creating a harmonious culture in Indian subcontinent, as Hindus were also allowed to visit in Sufi khanqahs. So South Asian Sufi authors produced a plethora of literature that played a significant role in understanding the various facets of Sufism. Conveniently, Sufi texts have been divided into various categories, broadly Tazkirat, Maktubat, and Malfuzat. Each genre has its own distinctive features and characteristics. Starting with Tazkirat, they are the memorial testimony of the Sufis and Sufi order with an attempt to communicate their legacy to a new generation. Sirul Aulia is one of the prominent Tazkira of Chishti Sufis that was authored by Amir Khud during 14th century. Moving to the next genre, Maktubat are the collection of the letters of the Sufis that enable us to understand their teachings. Maktubat-e-Sadi comprises the collection of the letters of Sheikh Sharfuddin Yahya Maneri, whose khanqah was who was from Firdausi Sufi order, and his khanqah was at Maner, which is situated in Bihar. Malfuzat are the most intriguing and popular genre of Sufi literature. Traditionally, Malfuzat are the collections of the table talks of the Sufis compiled by their disciples, and even sometimes that work gets edited by the Sufis to whom it has been attributed. They were the didactic texts that had political implications, also as they on occasions through rhetorical statements asserted the authority of Sufis over Sultan and Ulema. Malfuzat text can be considered as an alternative to the court chronicles, where court chronicle broadly emphasize the achievements, expeditions, and court culture of the political protagonist. Unlike them, Malfuzat text extended the limits of history writing beyond political events and governmental changes, as they enable us to reconstruct the social context of the period. Fawadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis are among the preeminent Malfuzat. Fawadul Fuad comprised the conversation of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, a prominent Sufi, which was compiled by Amir Hassan Sridzi, who was a contemporary to Amir Khusro and well-renowned poet of 13th-14th century. It comprises 188 assemblies compiled during the course of 14 years in an arbitrary pattern. On the other, Khairul Majalis comprises 100 assemblies of the conversation of Sheikh Nasiruddin Chiragh Dili, which was compiled by Hamid Qalandar in 1354. There are a list of malfuzat whose authenticity is doubtful, but unlike them, Faidul Fuad and Khairul Majalis both considered as genuine and authentic Sufi texts. During Delhi's Sultanate, women lived in appalling condition. According to K.M. Ashraf, in medieval India, women were subordinated by their fathers, brothers, and husbands. Moreover, the practice of child infanticide was prevalent in society, which shows that the birth of girl was not cherished. Several instances illustrate that parda and ghungat practice were also common in the Muslim and Hindu societies respectively. Ibn Battuta, a traveler, mentioned that he had frequently seen the various places like Ajodhan, Dhar, that Hindu women used to perform sati practice. It is interesting to know the Chishti Sufis' attitude towards women in such background. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia once remarked that, and I quote, "If lion comes out of jungle, nobody cares about its being a male or female," which implies that a person is to be known for his or her righteousness and devotion to God, irrespective to his gender. This remark shows the attitude of Chishti Sufis toward women. It is evident that they emphasized on gender equality in the medieval time. In his Malfuzat Anisul Arwa, Chishti Sufi Sheikh Usman Harwani, who was a peer of Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti, opines that daughters are the blessings from God. Furthermore, he states that God and Prophet are blessed with those who treat their daughters well. He also directed his followers to celebrate the birth of a girl child and refer to the hadith which promises salvation to the father of a daughter. Historian Tanveer Anjum pointed out that the daughter of early Sufis were devotional and pious. For instance, Bibi Hafiz Jamal, the daughter of Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti, was known for her piety and God consciousness. Similarly, the daughter of Sheikh Hamiduddin, Bibi Khatija, was pious and devotional woman who lived in austerity with her husband in Sowal. Tanveer Anjum also asserted that Sheikh Fariduddin wanted to nominate his daughter Bibi Sharifa as his successor. Sheikh Farid once said that had the succession of spiritual affair allowed to be granted to women, I would have appointed my daughter Bibi Sharifa as my Khalifa. Faidul Fuad and Khairul Majalis presented women from two distinct perspectives, that is, spiritual authority and spiritual barriers. The former described qualities like virtue, piety. Such women had firm faith in God and enacted spiritual interventions. These women are described as scholarly and had profound knowledge and believe in Sufism. In the same regard, Faidul Fuad and Khairul Majalis both presented Bibi Fatima Sam as one of such devotional women. According to Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, Bibi Fatima Sam was a modest, virtuous woman who resided at Indraprasth. At time passed, her spiritual qualities reached the ears of Sheikh Fariduddin, who was impressed and remarked that the lady was really a man sent to this world in the form of a woman. She had a great affection for Sheikh Najibuddin Mutawakkil, who was a younger brother of Sheikh Farid and used to reside at Delhi, whom she treated like a brother. Being in a Chishti mystic circle, Sheikh Najibuddin Mutawakkil lived a life of poverty and on most occasions had nothing to eat. When Bibi Fatima Sam came to know about his appalling condition, she often sent food for him. Similarly, Khairul Majalis also described a pious, scholarly, anonymous woman who had a profound knowledge of Sufism and authored many books. However, Sheikh Nasiruddin Chirage Delhi did not mention her name, and there is no other evidence to trace her. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia also highlighted gender equality in the male-dominated society of Delhi Sultanate. It is evident that during the medieval period, women were not regarded well. The birth of girl was not desirable among the certain groups in society, therefore acting as a voice of women. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia once said that father of a girl has good fortune. On other occasion, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia once said that there was a protective curtain was drawn between a hell and one who had a daughter. So these episodes reveal how Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia and Sheikh Nasiruddin Chirage Dilli presented women as spiritual authority who were also capable of attaining spiritual merits. Moreover, they depicted women as spiritual guide and role model in a male-dominated mystical world of Chishti Sufis. It implies that the mystical path was not limited to men, as women could also achieve the highest stage of mystical path. On the other, Fuadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis provide various examples where women had painted as wayward or as a barrier to spiritual path. On an occasion, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia narrated a story that once a dervish was en route to Ajodan to express his repentance to Sheikh Farid. During the journey, he confronted the wayward female singer who became inclined towards him and tried to come close to him. After slight hesitation, Dervish also falls tempted towards her. Suddenly, spiritual intervention happened, and someone appears and slapped on the face of Dervish. And he retorted that since you, you are on the way to Sheikh Farid to express repentance, and how could you be inclined towards her? Similarly, in another episode, Fuad provides that where Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia narrated a story related to Sheikh Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, who was the successor of Muinuddin Chishti, highlighting that he was so much involved in his marital life with his newly wedded wife that he failed to offer dura to the Prophet. Eventually, he divorced that wife. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia also pointed out that Sheikh Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki used to offer dura 300 times before sleeping. So one can find such episodes in Khairul Majalis also, in which Nasiruddin Chirage Dilli narrated a story in which a Christian woman who got infatuated with a Muslim man, and it is a story of Habib Kalbi, a young handsome Muslim man who was searching for grain and passed by a house of a beautiful Christian woman whose husband was out of town. When a woman came to know about a young man's situation, she called him to her home for grain free of cost, to offer grain him free of cost. When the man comes to her house, she closed the door and asked him for lovemaking. And the Muslim man resolutely refused her to fall into lovemaking. The woman started blackmailing him that if he would not make relation with her, she would noise and would gather people to embarrass him. In reply, the Muslim man stated that, "Oh mother," and I'm quoting that, "Oh mother, it would be better for him to get embarrassed in this life rather than in the next life." So in above episodes, Fuadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis also depicted women as a barrier to the attainment of the highest goal of mysticism. Such women were depicted as a wayward or lustful, which ultimately caused obstacle to the mystical path of Sufism. Before we jump on any conclusion, it is interesting to note that both of these malfuzat, these genre of Sufi literature, both of these malfuzat were didactic texts and compiled in the 14th century. So, as a conclusion, I would say that in In Fuadul Fuad and Khairul Majalis, one can find the two different perspectives of women. In one perspective, women have been presented as a pious and as a spiritual guide. On the other, women have been depicted as a wayward and lustful, as a spiritual barrier, as a barrier to the spiritual path. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that paper. I think we all really appreciated this very in-depth look into these texts that perhaps we would not have either found ourselves or accessed ourselves or even analyzed perhaps in this way ourselves. So thank you so much. That was really interesting, close reading, and the very detailed historical analysis that you've provided. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. So how are we doing on time? We're very good on time. I'm so happy. Okay. So let's move on to our final paper of the panel, and then we can have a Q&A session. Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end, and we can call on you at the end. So our next speaker is Kalimola Bashir. Are you here? Yes, hello. Okay, quick intro, and then go ahead. So Kaleemullah Bashir, I'm so sorry, I've been talking for a very long time. Kaleemullah Bashir is currently a senior at the Social Sciences and Liberal Arts Department at the IVA Karachi. Their name emerges from the Arabic word family KLLM. Are we talking in the Arabic letters?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Ka, Lam, Mim, am I correct?
Yeah.
Its meaning moves across different iterations of conversing, hearing, speaking, bearing witness. They translate across Punjabi, Urdu, and English. They are being trained in media and cultural studies, and their interests are oriented towards literary and poetic cultures across Urdu and Punjabi, which they read to trace mystical epistemologies across affective movements, queer excess, and the imaginings of the body and the spectral. So, their paper today is titled Imaginative Orientations, Femida Riyaz, and Sufi Feminist Embodiments. Thank you so much for being here, and please start whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm audible, I hope. Yes?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. No, first of all, I'll start with a generous thank you to the Tasavvur Collective for organizing this. This is the first time I'm presenting anywhere, so I'm really grateful for this accommodation. Thank you also to my other speakers in this panel. Really enriching conversations. I feel full after having been witness to the whole panel, even though I skipped lunch today. But I'll move to my presentation. So it's on Femida Riyaz. Femida Riyaz was born at the cusp of the partition in the Indian city of Meerut, one of the leading Urdu-phone intellectuals of her generation. She left behind an expansive and enriching body of work ranging from volumes of poetry, novels, essays, translations, and editorial magazines. Her work embodies the feminist and anti-imperialist spirit that allowed her voice to rise as a strong critic of the emerging norms of the new nation of Pakistan. Her second poetry collection, Badan Darida, or The Body Torn, was considered her first collection of explicitly feminist verse. Upon its publication in 1975, the collection received waves of harsh criticisms. The poems, which were on bodily desire, female sexuality, erotics, religion, and spirituality, often invoking many of these elements within singular scenes, were labeled as fahash or pornographic. In her preface, the preface to Badan Darida, she provides a hopeful reading of this backlash too. She asserts that the poet's work is to disturb the norms of that historical moment. Badan Darida continues receiving a lot of critical attention. After all, it deserves it as well. The poems within the collection invoke images of remembrance of the holy books, of prophets, of angels, and of the creation of world within scenes of eroticism that at the same time also situate agency within the female body. It has already been pointed out that Riyaz's translator subjectivity informed her work a lot. Day one, we had Heather Shahbaz's presentation in this gathering also, which spoke about that, and for that I'm grateful also. But from 70s onwards, Riyaz began intimately engaging with the work of various mystic poets by translating their work into Urdu. These vulnerable exchanges reoriented her voice too. The Sufi poetic culture became a rich source of feminist epistemology and revolutionary thought for her. My presentation today will attempt to trace this exact line of Sufi feminist thought within Fahmida Riaz's body of work. It must be acknowledged that Riaz's work during Zia's military regime, for instance, the poetry collection Badan Darida that I've been speaking about, still deserves a lot of our attention. However, providing too much focus on just one set of an author's writing and denying moving towards a journey of the author's later writing itself also does not come within the feminist mode of engagement. So hence my primary focus today will be on Fahmida Riaz's last novel, the last project she undertook and spent 2.5 years with. The novel is titled Qilla-e Faramoshi, The Castle of Forgetfulness. Written between the years 2014 and 2017, Qilla-e Faramoshi constructs the historical period around the life of the first proto-socialist in recorded history, Mazdak. Situated in the 5th century Sassanid Empire in Iran, we learn of a drought spread all over. There is a shortage of food and water all over the empire, which affects everyone except the king's functionaries, the mansabdars, who have their storage units filled with enough food stocks to sustain the entire kingdom for a year. Mazdak, we learn, is a well-read Zoroastrian cleric who has every verse of the holy book, the Avesta, locked away within memory. His subjectivity is oriented like that of a mystic. He had already learned some insightful lessons on communal level of care and equity from the work of Prophet Mani, who died 2 centuries before him, so in the 3rd century. Mazdak, at this point in the drought, began defying his cleric class, who had collaborated with the functionaries, and instead began distributing silver from the fire temples to the starving farmers. For Mazdak, faith is not divorced from the socioeconomic realities of the time. After some while, he begins announcing revolutionary ideas as revelations themselves. He claims to be a prophet of God, and within the holy book itself finds traces in support of his revolutionary ideas and invites everyone to mobilize together and assert their claim over the resources. Soon, a social upheaval unfolds. There are organized and strategic charges towards these storage houses that were filled that lead to a redistribution of the food within the public. It is based on his readings and interpretations of the holy book that he invites everyone to undo the gendered, economic, and social hierarchies of that time. The links between these modes of thinking have already been sort of established from an epistemological perspective, where on one hand, scholars have pointed out that processes of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism are informed by aspirations towards a transcendental subject often. We're supposed to aspire towards the colonial white overlord, the figure of the patriarch, or towards the excessive capital. On the other hand, from an epistemological perspective, queer feminism, Sufi poetics, and decolonial anti-imperialist thought works by detranscendentalizing these aspirations. The focus is reoriented on the body, on the relations we share with life around us, and towards resistance against hierarchical modes of relating with others. The fire on the farmer's stove is more important than the fire in the temple. Riaz's retelling of the unraveling of this social movement is in many ways constructed also by her own understanding of revolutionary processes. Riaz, who had already been introduced to the work of Frantz Fanon and Assia Jabbar during her undergraduate at the University of Sindh in Jamshoro, had an informed perspective on social movements too. In many ways, you can hear the echoes of Frantz Fanon's work within Mazdak's extensive focus on reimagining all conceptions of relations in their entirety within the revolutionary process and really just centering it and asserting it. At the same time, Assia Jabbar's intervention also can be traced within the book. Riaz's retelling of the history of the first proto-socialist movement centers the women and their perspective within the unraveling of this upheaval. The women in the book are active agents and have direct contributions to this history. They actively assert a dislocation of the situation of the female body from the private ownership and property discourse. Riaz's retelling tells us that if it wasn't for their contribution, the movement's success would have been contained merely to a few years instead of the 40 years that it continued. The very form of the book itself resembles Asya Jabbar's 1991 book, Far from Medina. It's available in English translation, which resulted from her interaction with the archives, focusing on early Islamic history, where she found more than 24 women just mentioned in passing, but rendered voiceless otherwise. Jabbar dwelled into the archive and traced the histories around these women, which he then reconstructed in her book. So the entire book just has separate chapters dedicated to these individual figures. Riaz's feminist and revolutionary touches within this retelling become even more visible if we trace the process of her writing. The preface of the book, of this book, Qilā Faramoshi, is titled Nakhun Ka Qarz, or The Nails Debt. It begins with a couplet from Ghalib. In Urdu, it goes, Kavish ka dil kare hai taqaza ke hai hunuz, nakhun pe qarz is gir rahe neem bhaas ka. It roughly translates to, the heart makes a claim for scratching, for there is still a debt of the fingernails to the half-open knot. One of the primary motives of her rewriting this history, she says in the preface to the book, is to help provide a voice to those rendered voiceless and invisible within history. This is work not done for the structures of credibility, but instead very much to untie this half-open knot, to bring back the histories swallowed up by the shadows. This is also why the book is in a novel form after all. It allows for the affective to seep into the text. It allows her to be a reluctant yet playful historian. She prepares a long list of her resources and cites every single one of them in the preface. She had learned of Mazdak from and relied most for her research on Mazdak through Firdausi's Shahnama. She had learned of the Shahnama through her translatory engagement with Rumi and Shams Tabriz, who she translated into Urdu. Her other sources were the Bible and the Avesta itself, that she closely read to make sense of that historical period and learn from the text herself, and also to trace the emergences of the norms around that period. With that, her other sources, which is really interesting and fascinating to me, were Orientalist scholars who had written around that period or had carried out extensive close readings of texts from that period. Rather than referring to Sitte Hassan's writing or Allama Iqbal's writing, both of whom had written extensively about Mazdak within Urdu language, Riaz instead moved towards the texts of these other scholars that I just mentioned. By entering the texts of these Orientalist scholars, she carries out close feminist readings to retell the life around Mazdak's movement in a manner that doesn't reproduce the same Orientalist tropes. In many ways, these archival methods are reflective of the sort of strategies that Riaz had used all her life for her revolutionary work too. Sarah Fatima, who has a chapter dedicated to Fehmida Riaz in her 2019 book, suggests a reading of Fehmida Riaz's body of work as, quote, an ethical guide to the art of dissidence, unquote. I suspect Fatima may be right for suggesting this. Riaz had entered Urdu, the language, despite her mother tongue being Sindhi, because the Pakistani nation state centered the Urdu language. Yet, at the same time, her translatory work tried to displace the monolingual efforts of the state. She criticized also very actively these same neo-imperialist efforts within her Urdu writings as well. At the same time, under Zia's regime, as writer and translator Asad Alvi has highlighted, she engaged with Zia's embellishing of Muslim nationalism through the figuration of the Pakistani women's body as the honor of the Islamic nation, by instead using vocabulary and concepts she learned from the Sufi mystic poets to speak of women's bodies as carriers of desire and agency instead. Here, she entered the texts of Orientalist writers and returned with a feminist retelling of the same period. She gained intimate knowledge of the protocols of these credibility structures and toppled then these structures also. No women were given any focus within any of the pre-written histories around this period. Riaz incorporates different materialities and different physicalities to center these perspectives. Returning now to the second half of the book, we learn now that Mazdak's movement has undone the strict class relations and at the same time also helped at a great degree to break down the societal control over women's bodies and sexualities. The drought has now left us, and there have been extensive reforms within the kingdom that map out a lot of these changes. However, in the 4th decade since the beginning of this movement, the older societal hierarchies are recuperated. The mansabdars, the functionaries, return and take over the kingdom and begin undoing all the Mazdaki reforms. This is the part where we learn of the Qilla-e Faramoshi, the castle of forgetfulness, after which the book is named. It is a structure towards the margins of the capital city. Those who are to be forgotten by the collective memory and history are sent to this castle. No one is allowed to take their names. No one is allowed to take the castle's name. After just a few paragraphs of meditating on the structure, the book too forgets about the castle. We return to the kingdom, where the new king strategically captures all of Mazdak's followers, including Mazdak also, of course, hangs them upside down, exactly the way they wanted the social structures to be overturned, and collectively slaughters them. Mazdak's name is strategically removed from all official documents. This was chapter 19. It ends here. The story of Mazdak, it's supposed to end here. Chapter number 20, which is the last chapter, takes us across time into the 20th century, where a young 18-year-old girl sits on her roof, really close to the abandoned castles of Ranikot in Sindh. She opens up a book that was given to her by a boy that she really admired. She begins reading, Aaj Europe ek ufreed se khaufzada hai. Communism ka ufreed. It is an Urdu translation of the first line of the Communist Manifesto. A specter haunts Europe, the specter of communism. The young girl had learned of this book through her friends from university who were distributing this literature around and inviting everyone to read and think about the economic conditions under the military regime. The last paragraph from her last book is her recalling the scene where she first looks at an image of Marx. वो अपने वतन से कभी भी बाहर नहीं गई थी, ना किसी यूरोपी को मिली थी. फिर क्यों ये ऐसा अजीब सा एहसास लग रहा था कि जैसे उसने इस आदमी को कहीं देखा है, कहीं बहुत गौर से, और उसने इस लड़की को कोई चीज दी थी, जैसे कोई पहचान. I translate a bit roughly. She had never left her country, nor had she met any European. Then why did it seem like she had seen this man before, seen him closely, and that he had given something to her, a sense of identity? The young girl was Famida Riaz herself, studying at the University of Sindh in Jamshoro, very close to Ranikot. The beginning and the end of the book both weave the author personally into the text. Saira Ahmed says, the personal is theoretical. The I and the we in our stories inform the notions of collective memory and how we map our histories. This story becomes about the ghosts of her youth and the afterlives of the ghosts that have been contained within the margins of history. The story is not just of a young Famida Riaz learning of a ghost haunting Europe, but instead about the ghost that has haunted normative structures across histories and geographies. By connecting Marx and Mazdak across history, by bringing in the echoes of the many other revolutionary thinkers within this retelling, Riaz integrates the dead into the living, the past into the present. She pushes against the weight of linear unraveling. By situating the revolutionary ideals within mystical knowledge forms, and by recentering our focus on the body and the relations that we share with others, Riaz reminds us that to resist is a part of our being, not doing. That's it from me.
Thank you so much for that. This was just it was incredibly interesting. I haven't read this novel before, but I've read Famida Riaz in general, and it was there are so many things that I picked up on that I want to quiz you on later in the Q&A. But I think to sum up, I really liked how you ended on this, the like ghosts within the margins of history. And of course, this book within a book that we see at the end of her novel as well. It's just really, really incredible. So thank you for picking this text as well. And thank you for picking us to talk about this paper. I can see that the chat is blowing up saying that it was great. So well done. So now we've ended so well on time. I'm astounded at myself. So I think let's take a couple of minutes or so. Everyone, please hydrate. Let's all breathe. If you have any questions, again, put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. If panelists have any questions for each other, again, raise your hand, and I'm happy to facilitate that. You mentioned Heather's presentation, Kaleemullah. He's in the chat right now because he was here. So yay. Again, thank you so much. So let's take 30 odd seconds, and then let's reconvene for a quick Q&A before our next talk.
I'm going to stop recording now. So yeah.